We had a client who was very successfully releasing episodes consistently. The audience was responding well to the podcast. And parallel tracked with that, they were also running a very successful webinar strategy. But what they weren't seeing is that the leads from the podcast and from the webinar, neither one of those were converting in the ways that they really thought should be at the level based on the amount of people attending or the amount of people listening. And what we noticed was that a couple of things were happening. The audience of the webinar started dropping off because after they had repeated webinars, they were reaching the same audience over and over again. And we looked at the podcast and realized that they weren't even talking about the fact that these webinars were happening in their podcast. So the first thing that we did was make sure the messaging in the podcast were taking elements from the webinars, maybe nuggets from the content, letting people know that their webinars were happening, how to learn more about the webinars from going to their website. So we were introducing these educational deep dive opportunities to an audience that weren't already familiar with the webinars. And then we were also looking at the content as it was being delivered within the webinar and realizing that they had a huge opportunity to grow the audience for their podcast by just introducing the podcast to the webinar attendees. So in that way, we encourage them to utilize the podcast in their call to action as they were wrapping up the webinar. Maybe the lead wasn't ready to convert right away to a sales transaction, but because of the webinar experience, they wanted to know more about the host of the webinar. They wanted to know more about the business model. And the best way to do that was for them to be introduced to the podcast and continue to build the trust and the relationship with that lead that they generated with the webinar, nurture that through the podcast content, and then having that call to action in the podcast be to go back again to the website and really holistically fill out that circle of lead, conversation, webinar, education, podcast lead. It all worked really well when they coexisted together.